The question arises, are we really distinct from the machines that we create ourselves? We are fully embodied beings. Everything that is visible and that is movable and that is sensible in our experience is the living body. So it's not something that we can separate from. To a certain extent, a book is a kind of a detachment of thought, of thinking, and an externalization and sedimentation into some written text, printed text. You could get the idea that the mind is something external because it can be in a sedimented form and symbolized form. It can be externalized. Progress replaces the ancient history of salvation. And we are constantly switching between a narcissistic grandiosity on the one hand and a self-contempt, a self-disdain even on the other hand. So we are constantly switching, oscillating, and this instability is visible in our relation to AI. We identify with the thoughts because we forget that in order to think, we first have to be alive.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Love and Philosophy. I'm so glad you're here. This is a conversation with Thomas Fuchs, who is a philosopher and a psychiatrist at the Universität Heidelberg in Germany. This university, which is in this fairy tale looking town you may recognize with the castles and the water and the beautiful colors, and it's a place where famous philosophers walked and famous scientists. So he's following in that tradition. He's the Karl Jaspers professor there, and he's written a lot of very interesting books. The one we're going to talk about today is In Defense of the Human Being, and there's a word I want to highlight from the beginning, which we discussed. This is a very beautiful move that Thomas makes in his writing, where he talks about intersubjectivity as conviviality, which is what we're going to talk about as kind of the cure to the oscillation or the even rather bipolar swing between self-hate and self-transcendence or self-aggrandizement that seems to happen in our lives more and more, at least in our societies and the way that we're interacting with one another. But I want to bring up this word conviviality because it's actually easy to not hear it, what it really means. But con means with or together, C-O-N, the root of it. So it's with life, with living, with one another. It's a way of thinking about life as shared and the body as a particular sensing of shared living. It's conviviality. It's coming into awareness of the withness of our living. That's different than there's this life and there's this life and there's this life, all these lives, and they're trapped. Instead, this is life, which is complex, multidimensional, but continuous. And these sensory bodies are a way of being with that life and coming into it and coming to know it. We feel pulled in directions that don't allow us to appreciate what it actually means to be a human being. This incredible, wonderful experience we're having doesn't actually get fully experienced because we are confused by the oscillation of hating what it means to be human or being rather repulsed or disgusted by what humans do or by our own inability to live up to certain kind of imagined standards as a body. Or the opposite of that, we get a bit carried away in the aggrandizement whereby there's a power to be felt in connecting with life and feeling as if we are ourselves responsible for that wonder and wanting to take all of that power as if it belongs to our body. So there's an oscillation between wanting to rule the world and wanting to escape it. It's our sensory body that allows us the conviviality, the intersubjectivity. Another interesting point in this conversation is the theory of mind is not what we think it is. What Thomas says is really quite interesting, and it's kind of his answer in a way to a lot of the binary, polarized decisions or dichotomies that we get sort of oscillated between these days. The conviviality. Maybe you can hear it in a different way, because when I hear that word as an American, I sort of listen over it. It sounds like a little happy word, but if you really look into the roots of it, vivality, this living life, and con with, and it already has an intersubjectivity to it, where a certain sensory form of life and consciousness. And wow, I mean, isn't that amazing that we are that we are coming into awareness of that we are with life in that way? That's the heart of intersubjectivity. Although, of course, there's many academic and much drier ways of talking about it that are also good to explore, but I want to start with that feeling and the livingness and being with the livingness and appreciating the story of self, but realizing it's perhaps like training wheels towards understanding that we're experiencing the presence of life as ourselves, and that is our connection with all that is living. We are with it. We are with the living. We are convivial. So that's just to take us into this conversation with Thomas Fuchs, who is a philosopher who works with embodied cognition, and he's also a psychiatrist. He is wearing a lot of hats, and we talk about how that itself is a bit of a practice of this conviviality and intersubjectivity, the kind of transcendence that doesn't require one to reject or escape from the body. And this conversation is about thinking of a new kind of embodied understanding of what it means to be human. If you want to hear the rest of the thoughts about all of these issues that just came impromptu, then you can check out the research diaries on the YouTube. But for now, let's go into the conversation. I do want to say thank you to everyone who has sent emails or support. Thank you for signing up for the Substack, the Love and Philosophy Substack, and anyone who's listening who hasn't signed up for the Substack or gone to the YouTube, I hope you will now, and I love that we get to connect. So I'm sending you a lot of love and philosophy. Hi, Thomas. Thank you so much for doing this. It's great to see you.
Hi, Andrea.
Today we're going to talk about your book, In Defense of the Human Being, which I just love. There's so much in here I want to talk to you about, but for the general audience, just to start, why does the human being need to be defended?
Well, the idea of the book is that a defense of the human being is necessary in several respects, which have to do with the current development of technology and science and communication. So there are various fields in society where the traditional image of the human being as embodied being in the world with others is questioned.
That was kind of a big question for me to ask you right off.
Yeah, that's really a big question because it opens up all kinds of fields that are touched in the book, of course. Well, the first field is the development of artificial intelligence, where the question arises, are we really distinct from the machines that we create ourselves? And are we kind of machines ourselves which run by algorithms? And that's at least what we find in ideas of digitalization proponents and some, for example, in ideas of Yuval Harari, the historian with his book Homo Deus. The second field is transhumanism, the idea that we can transform our own bodies into some kind of cyborgs or other kinds of machines, and that we can ultimately upload our minds onto digital computers and gain immortality through this. This is, of course, an extreme position, but on the way to this goal, there are many possibilities of optimizing the human being, of enhancement, of changing the human nature into something new, into something similar to a cyborg. And then there is the development of virtualization in society. So the increasing disembodiment of communication, the increasing leveling of the difference between reality and virtuality. so that people can no longer distinguish between, reality and simulation, or between truth and fake, between appearance and the real communication and the real encounter with the other. So all these developments question the image of man that was based on the idea that the human being is a person. A person means an embodied being that is related to others through his or her body, and that is not located somewhere in the brain, and that is not equal to some neuronal algorithms that run through the brain. So this traditional image of man is something I want to defend, but not only in the traditional sense, but in the of a traditional humanism, which was rather anthropocentric, but in the sense of a new humanism, an embodied humanism that sees the human being in constitutive relation to the environment, in relation to other living beings, and in relation to the ecological environment. So that would be a new kind of humanism, but it is still based on embodiment.
I started with a really big question because it seems almost obvious that we would defend what it means to be alive, even, and to be, and human. But to be honest, your work is one of the only ones I've seen that actually notices this and takes a position of life being something wonderful, which sounds almost hard to believe or too simplistic. But what happens, it seems, and what you show in the book, it goes to two extremes where either the human is something we're contemptible of, either through our own feelings, personal feelings of contempt, or through what we see that the human has done to the natural world, for example. And then on the other side, there's this glorification, or almost as if we could be omnipotent or powerful, usually through technology, as you were just expressing. So, and you go into so many examples. You talk about, for example, Greek tragedy or Dostoevsky or Nietzsche, all these philosophers dealing with this feeling that we have of either contempt for ourselves or wanting to be overpowerful, or feeling how powerful life is, but we can't sit with it in the moment, as you're suggesting we do in the book, with life and with presence, but instead we must somehow, through technology, make it perfect. Do you see this as a theme that's been around as long as humans? Is it part of us, or what's going on there with this seeming dichotomy?
To a certain extent, it may be part of us, because we're beings that have an instability, so to speak. Being human means to have an eccentric position, so to speak. That's what the German philosopher Helmut Plessner called it. Eccentric means out of the center, being able to decenter oneself and seeing oneself from outside, so to speak. This makes us able to transcend ourselves and to enter genuine intersubjectivity. On the other hand, it also enables us to imagine ourselves in all kinds of ways greater than we are, to transcend ourselves towards superior power and superior possibilities that obviously fuels human and technological progress over the last centuries. But in my view, this development has really gained in impact since modernity. And since modernity, we have kind of lost our centeredness in the world, and have become metaphysically homeless beings, so to speak, with the increasing retreat of God into some outer world, so to speak, and the increasing loss of religious background. We have become metaphysically homeless, and we try to compensate for this through our own empowerment, through our constant striving for more progress, more growth, more wealth. So the earthly progress replaces the ancient history of salvation. And since then, we are constantly switching between an grandiose image of ourselves, a narcissistic grandiosity on the one hand, and a self-contempt, a self-disdain even on the other hand. That's what you pointed out before. So we are constantly uh, what- switching, oscillating between the grandiosity on the one hand and the self-contempt and self-insufficiency on the other hand. And this instability is visible in our relation to AI. AI is on the one hand something which we think of as the ultimate progress, the ultimate godlike power that we acquire through creating something like superior intelligence, even superior to ourselves, creating conscious beings somehow. That's at least the idea. On the other hand, it puts us into a relation of inferiority. It leads to a shame of ourselves because we are only earthly bodily beings that are not able to compete with our own creations. And in this narcissistic instability between self-grandiosity on the one hand and self-inferiority on the other hand, we are constantly oscillating and trying to cope with this instability. And I think we have to overcome this narcissistic image of the human being and acquire something modest self-image that, on the other hand, doesn't lead to the idea that we would have to, well, that Earth would be better off without us. So we have to abdicate our own rule, and we should rather, be replaced by a superior intelligence. That is, of course, the depressive view, the pessimistic view that is somehow represented by post-humanism, for example. And we have to find a new equilibrium, a more modest position, a more modest image of ourselves as human beings in relation to the world, to the environment. That is what the book aims for.
Yes, I think a lot of us can understand contempt for the body in a sense, or that the body doesn't do what you want it to do or look how you want it to look or compare well with others around you from your perspective, and so you want to escape it. And there is something about technology that feels inviting in that way. I think on a basic level, people can understand that. But what I feel in your book and in a lot of your other work is this, what I think you talk about it as inner bodily resonance in some places, life itself as being the experience, and really being in the body and realizing this amazing sense of the body. How could we really think about embodiment in terms of what we've opened up so far, about the body itself as maybe the center of these different problems or beginnings of this, or the place where it will be resolved?
Yeah. Embodiment has a manifold meaning, and we should distinguish first between two ways of thinking of the body. The usual one is a more or less dualistic way of thinking of the body as something that we have, and that we kind of as an object, as an instrument. So we think of ourselves as somehow in being located in the brain, or being a kind of a soul-like consciousness that is located in the body and uses it as an instrument and tries to modify it, to optimize it, to change the body image. So everything external that the body, that the body can show to others and can show. So that would be the more or less dualistic way of thinking of the body. But what is before that is, of course, that we are living bodies, that we are embodied, and that is experience that is not easy to grasp, because it doesn't mean that we are in our body, rather that we inhabit our whole body, that we are our whole body, and that every experience is based on this very vital feeling that emerges from our whole body. The vital feeling means feeling of being alive, and that accompanies all our actions, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, but that is deeper, embodied, ingrained, so to speak, in our body, because it emerges from from the constant interaction between the brain and the body as a whole. So this vital feeling, which also continues in certain drive states like hunger or thirst or strivings, which also manifests itself in basic moods that we are in, the basic moods that we ask for when we ask, well, how are you at the moment? Then we look at kind of express our momentary mood and say, well, I'm fine. It's okay. So we express an overall state that is, in fact, our own bodily state. And this very basic feeling of being alive is what fuels every other, expression of ourselves, that what fuels every other experience and action. And it is deeply immersed in the body. That is something that we usually are not aware of because it's always in the background of our experience.
Can we say it
But
is the body? Is it in the body or is it the body? Because
no, it is the body.
Okay.
It is the body as a living body.
Thanks.
It is not something that we are within the body. There is no, we are not existing two times, so to speak. We are not double persons, so the ones that are visible, and then there is another person within the visible body. No, we are fully embodied beings. Everything and that is visible and that is movable and that is sensible in our experience is the living body. So it's not something that we can separate from.
And yet with our language and the way that we come to as that lived body, that whole living experience, we become more and more aware of that experience, which is ourselves. And there's something about that, which you've already talked about a bit, this almost, it's not that we've got two of us, but we are in a way setting ourselves against ourselves as subject and object in a kind of pattern, even though we're always this whole lived body. I find this very hard to talk about, which is why I'm going into it, because it gets very confusing. But I think what you're showing in your work is this is a wholeness, a continuity of living and experience, even though we might not have full awareness of that. That ability to sit and realize the feeling of being alive is quite spectacular. And we're not often doing that, are we?
Yeah, no, certainly not. We are usually, immersed in the environment, engaged in our thoughts, in our projects, or in interaction with others or with the world outside. It is all fine, but we lose in this involvement, in this engagement, we sometimes lose the anchoring in our lived body, which nevertheless is, of course, always the basis for this engagement. And we think that we are kind of of mental, spiritual, or other kinds of beings which can exist even outside or without the body. But that is obviously not possible because our feeling of being alive is based in the organism as a whole. The idea that we are somehow different from our body is the product of our capacity for reflection. And that is, of course, something particularly human as well. We are able, as I said before, to kind of step out of our embodied center virtually and think and see ourselves as if from the outside, which is the possibility that opens up the understanding of others. Understanding others means stepping outside of my own center virtually and taking the perspective and the view of the other. And this is what enables the young child at around 8 or 9 months of life to take the perspective of others in joint attention. And gradually, the child realizes that it is also seen by others, addressed by others from their point of view. And if the child realizes that, then it can kind of internalize this external perspective to look at itself from the outside, so to speak, and to address itself, to gain a relation to itself. And this is the basis for the development of reflective self-consciousness. And this reflection creates the appearance that we could somehow detach ourselves from our embodied center, because we're thinking, we're moving in imaginary worlds. We can imagine all kinds of places that we are at without changing our location as living bodies. And that creates the idea we could somehow detach ourselves from the body. We could be even souls or other kinds of mental beings that could leave the body. This was development since antiquity. You find it in Plato. You find it, of course, in the development of Christianity. And it has reached a certain climax in Descartes, which is famously the climax of thinking of the human being in two kinds of substances. We have overcome this dualism to a certain extent, but we still think we could be kind of detached subjects where the body is only an object of our interest, of our aims, of our goals, and that we could use it as a kind of instrument. And it's hard to overcome this dualistic completely. We are very much shaped by it in the Western world.
Even our language, the way we talk to one another, it's rooted in that mindset that it's hard to realize you're using that mindset as you're using it, at least in my experience in English. So there's the added complication, which you've talked about in other books, where it feels like it's in our head, which we then associate with the brain. And then we think, okay, everything is in the brain, which also isn't true, but is easy to do because this process itself gets us to identify with our thoughts as if we are our thoughts. Does that make sense? Do you find that? Yeah.
That makes sense. Yes. We identify with the thoughts because we forget that in order to think, we first have to be alive. That's, of course, a reason why we shouldn't remain in the field of thoughts for too long time. That's even what Descartes recommended to Elizabeth of Palatine when she asked him about the mind-body problem. He recommended not to think too much about the question of how the mind could be related to the body, because it's a very complicated question. And he recommended that you should rather, rely on the process of life, rely on everyday living. And that shows the unity of mind and body, because it's hard to conceive. Well, I think it's impossible to conceive if we take a Cartesian basis, a Cartesian presupposition for it. But at least he was quite clear about the need to come back from the region and the realm of thought into embodied life, because otherwise we do not experience the unity. The unity is the primary experience, but it can only be lived in the everyday interaction with things, with the world, with others. And I think the more we use our embodied capacities, for example, for playing instruments, for singing, for dancing, for interacting with objects in a skillful way, the more we do that and come back from the region of thought into real life, the less are we in danger of getting trapped in the mind, so to speak.
I think a lot of people understand that if you have a certain thought process and you get stuck in it, especially if it's one that's negative about yourself, if someone says something negative, or if we can't do something, or because we've taken this thought to be ourselves, that then we do get into that state of what Dostoevsky writes about, where there is a kind of burdensomeness to being present to your thoughts in that way, or we just want to escape into something that's bodiless, which we associate with our technology, because it's almost as if we create these models that are the perfections of us that actually don't work or have any use unless we are using them, but then we associate our perfection state with that use of that technology. So this looping that we've been describing starts to get very confusing, doesn't it? Because then we think somehow that we can get out of our body and become this distilled perfection that we've put into our technology, which requires our body to even make sense. But it starts to get very confusing.
Yeah, the burden of the body that you address is, of course, that is vulnerable. That as bodily beings, we know that we are vulnerable, that we are exposed to possible dangers, and that we are, of course, exposed to the ultimate danger and the ultimate certainty, namely to die. And mortality is something that is, that becomes clear to us through reflection. It's not the immediate feeling, because the immediate feeling of being a body is the vital feeling of life, and there is nothing mortal in it as such. But the mortality is, of course, part of our fate as organisms, as living organisms. And since we know that the organism is vulnerable and mortal, this is obviously greatest burden that our bodily existence brings to us. I think striving for technological progress and self-optimization of the human body is ultimately aimed at somehow overcoming the mortality of the body. That fuels this constant striving for technological progress in the end. And a certain humility towards our embodiment would also be a kind of remedy against this constant overburdening of ourselves with the aim of getting rid of the body. I think that's an useless and illusionary endeavor, and we should rather be content with our body, with our bodily existence, because it is the one that makes us that creates the freedom of human life, and also the richness and the wealth of human life.
And you show that we've maybe tricked ourselves a little bit too, that we feel so almost disgusted with our vulnerability, or the fact that we lose someone, or that death exists, that we become afraid, these things, and then we try to escape it into technology by becoming the technology. But you show that's a bit of a trick, because in the same way we've gotten caught up thinking we are our thoughts when actually we are embodied. You're not going to download your mind into something that's emerged out of your interaction with the mind, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely, because the technology creates the impression that our mind and our experience is ultimately something like information processing, kind of combined algorithmic process, and that we could exist without the living body just as information. And artificial intelligence, with all its fascinating progress, has also created the idea that the impression that mental processes could be just purely information processing. But that is obviously wrong, because what AI uses and ChatGPT uses is our already performed and experienced thinking. So our thinking is sedimented in all kinds of electronic and paper copies. So in all kinds of data of written language, this is the sedimentation of our lived experience. And AI kind of lives from this, or gains from this sedimented basis of our thoughts. And the thoughts that we find in AI agents such as ChatGPT are only meaningful for us and not for the systems. But we tend to forget that all meaningfulness of these thoughts or sentences or texts is created primarily through our own embodied being, where everything that is meaningful is related to the organism for whom there is something like good or bad, attractive or repulsive, or an advantage or a disadvantage. So the basic meaning of all these texts is ultimately related to our own embodied sense of life. There is no other
Right.
source of meaningfulness in the world. And then when we understand the texts that AI systems produce, then again, they become only meaningful for us because we have certain interests in our lives, because we have certain goals, we have problems, we have all kinds of things that we have to solve and that we want to know. But all these interests, all this striving, all these goals are ultimately related to our own living embodiment, because only from there do the values, the goals, the wishes, the interests arise from, which lend meaning to texts.
Exactly.
Meaningful.
The same way we confuse our thoughts with being us, that we think we are our thought. It's a similar pattern, I think, that you show, that we then confuse our technology as ourselves, as if they're all nested into one another and you can't take them apart. However, it doesn't feel that way. In the same way that it feels like we are our thoughts and we forget our body, now it's becoming, we feel like we are going to become our technology and forget the body.
Yes, in both cases, there's the similar. There are similar illusions that are created through the thought processes and through the externalized thought processes. All these kind of books here behind me are, of course, externalized thought processes of people.
It's almost like trying to download ourselves into a book, right? We can't. It's no different, is it really? I mean, it's really the same kind of thing of thinking we can download ourselves into other technology, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. There's no principal difference. And it can create the impression that mind is something that is external and detachable from embodied experience. Because to a certain extent, a book is a kind of a detachment of thought, of thinking, and an externalization and sedimentation into some written text and printed text. And then you could get the idea that the mind is something external because it can be in a sedimented form and symbolized form. It can be externalized. But this is, of course, wrong, because this book, without any human beings on Earth, doesn't have any meaningfulness. It as a book, it doesn't really exist. It's just an object, a physical object that has no meaning whatsoever. So only in the context of human beings that can, take this book, read it, and lend meaningfulness to it, it can become real meaning, whereas before it is at most a potential meaning.
I think this is wonderful because the book itself is very potent when we have these human bodies, because in a way, the books that you've written will be read on, and there is a transmission there that's going on, but it's very much nested in that body, lived bodily experience. So I can see how confusing it can get, that we think we've put something into the book and that the book itself now has your thoughts in it. But I think what you do and where you answer this for people is with the idea in your book, you lay it out in a particular way and through intersubjectivity and second person. So maybe we could try to unpack that a bit for people.
Yeah.
I guess what we've been talking about is more, so first person is like the lived experience, how we feel if I identify with my thoughts. And then we create this other world we've been talking about, like the books and so on, which is a more third person shared world. And they're not distinct, but we talk about them like that. And we often forget there's another there's something else in there too, right? And what is that?
That is the second person perspective. Yeah, we haven't talked about that so far in more detail. Well, of course, first person perspective and subjectivity wouldn't be able to develop into our human existence without the other, without early interaction between bodies that Merleau-Ponty has called intercorporeality. And we do not talk here about language already, but we talk about the very basic interaction with others that gives us and gives the baby a sense of being open to others, of being with others, of being in a constant resonant relationship with them. So resonance means that the bodies interact with each other in a way where expression and impression constantly transition into each other, and when I feel the other's body with my own body in bodily resonance. And this is the basis for empathy, for early bonding with others, and for all processes that we have already addressed before, like joint attention, acquiring the upright gait, acquiring language. For all these socialization processes, intercorporeality is the crucial basis, because without this, there would be no capacity of imitating others, of empathizing with others, of understanding others, and ultimately understanding their language and gradually. So intercorporeality is the basis for our sociality. And the second person perspective is precisely the one in which we experience each other as embodied living beings with a particular expressiveness. So we don't look at others from a third person point of view as bodies in the sense of the physical body, the physiological body, in the way the doctor does it, or a physiologist, or a neuroscientist. These are third-person views on the body as an organism that can be investigated in all kinds of ways. But that is not the attitude that we have when we experience and encounter each other in the second-person perspective, where the other is not somehow behind his gaze or behind his face, somehow inside the body, but the other is, of course, the full bodily being that we also experience ourselves to be. Also for you, I'm not somehow behind or in my body, but my gestures, my speaking, my voice, my gaze, all that is me. And I'm not somehow a second person inside. And this attitude we experience each other. And this is the intercorporeal or second person perspective, where the other is a you as a full bodily being, and where I experience myself as the other's you as a full bodily being. So this is the crucial basis of all kinds of intersubjectivity, even the basis for, virtual, digitalized intersubjectivity, which gains increasing importance, of course, today, and which somehow more or less replaces our embodied interactions to a sometimes problematic extent. But even then, even if we interact with each other only by written text or by email, then we ultimately rely upon the possibility of meeting, encountering the other as the full embodied being at least once at the end, because otherwise we wouldn't rely on the written text. We imagine and we anticipate the other as the full person behind the text.
It's that nestedness again that we take for granted. In the same way our thoughts don't make sense if we're not the body having them, but we forget the body. In the same way we confuse ourselves to thinking we are our thoughts, and then we can confuse that with images or technologies, and how that's almost like taking us out of our actual capacity. And This reminds me of your Fromm lecture. You won this really prestigious prize in Europe, the Eric Fromm Prize. And you talked about these issues in a different way, that we've identified with our images, or we've started to glorify the images or this technology, and we've lost touch with our own basic humanity. I think you almost compare it to a kind of narcissistic state that we've somehow fallen into, these tendencies of us to mistake ourselves for our thoughts, ourselves for our technology. When we start doing that to one another, it seems to become even more, what's the word, numbing or something?
Numbing.
Yeah.
At least we tend to miss the other in his bodily presence. And current concepts of intersubjectivity, which we find in social science, social psychology, also in neuroscience, based on the idea that the other is not accessible to us, that the other is somehow a being that we have to, or a process that we have to infer from external signs. That is the well-known concept of theory of mind, which is pervasive in the social sciences. That is the idea that we have to have a theory of how others function, of how others think, of how others work, so to speak, because there is no way of access to the other, because he is a mind in this concept. He is behind the body. He or she is inaccessible to us, and therefore we need to develop a kind of concept of what others really are behind their visible behavior. That is the concept of theory of mind. And this is, of course, a very strange concept, because it puts us into a position of a scientist who has to kind of detect a foreign species and to make sense of what this species does, as if we would hypothesize and experiment with other people and find out what they really think and what they really feel. And this is obviously not our primary relation to others. It can be the case, and it can be helpful in the case of, for example, a lack of immediate communication, as, for example, in a poker game. In a poker game where everybody tries to hide as much as possible every feeling, every expression, which is a very artificial situation, of course. And there you can, of course, use something like a inference-based approach. What could he have in mind? What is his strategy? And so on. But that is a very artificial and special situation. In everyday contact, you don't need such a stance of an observer or a scientist or a poker player to kind of find out and infer what is going on in the other. Our primary relation to others is always intercorporal. And we couldn't live with each other if we wouldn't experience each other primarily as living beings, or as I also call it, in conviviality. Conviviality means that we are living beings like other living beings, that we share basic experiences of embodiment, of feelings, of how it feels to move, how it feels to be tired, to fall asleep, to wake up again, of how it is to feel hunger, to have need for nourishment, of even how it feels to be vulnerable, and even how it is to be mortal. All this is what we share with each other and with other living beings, and this is our primary attitude towards others. We do not experience others or other living beings as strange objects that we have to make sense of, and that we have to find out about what is going on in them. We are in conviviality with each other. That is our primary relation, our primary attitude.
This is a powerful thing. If we can come into our body and realize there's another living body present with us, it's amazing how it changes how it feels to be alive. that we are life nested within life. And so taking another body seriously as real is kind of part of that same process of not doing what you just described of thinking it's all hallucination or thinking we're all stuck inside of our bodies. I guess it goes kind of both ways. It reminds me of something you say in one, I think in the book, of how right now we regard like our third person models or the books we were talking about or something as real, or the electron is real. And maybe sometimes we also think our own experience as an I, the subjective experience, is real. But we forget that what we're doing now, what life is, this relation, conviviality, is just as real, right? We don't even think about it or put a focus on it, do we? Is that the answer you're offering, Thomas, in a way, in the book? Is, first of all, to notice this, and in noticing it, we have to kind of come back into our body? Is that kind of the portal through which we can maybe realize we're not our thoughts, to stick with the theme of what we were talking about?
Yes, that's the solution that I propose to many problems that we experience and that we encounter in current society. Develop this in more detail, of course, but the solution would be that coming back to bodily presence with ourselves and coming back to bodily presence with others is the ultimate, ground of experience of reality. And this experience of reality is kind of threatened through many developments, through the idea that we are our thoughts, through the idea that we are our brains, or through the idea that we are ultimately algorithms, and could be uploaded onto other substrates and so on. And so this ultimate reality of immediate bodily presence is a solution to, I think, to many problems that we encounter in current society.
I agree, but it's hard too, isn't it? I don't want it to seem like this is easy. It is hard to come into awareness of yourself. This isn't the easiest process to become aware of yourself. It can be overwhelming. It can be very hard to know how to deal with the fact that you now are aware of your body. So how do you see ways we can help each other do this? In the book, you say all these problems we face in terms of environment or mental states, they're going to have to start with us inhabiting our body. So this is the hard work that we're going to do. But how do you see the ways we can help each other in that second person space?
We have to create enough options for being together, which is not a matter of course today, because people become increasingly lonely. Development we observe in most Western societies. An epidemic of loneliness was the title of a book that was edited by the General Surgeon of the US in last year. Our epidemic of loneliness, that means we are losing the embodied experience of being with others in a shared space, in a group, doing things together, experiencing joy together, in exchange, in immediate contact, in shared practice. But we are increasingly moving into some kind of virtual interactions and virtual spaces where the other is not present in the immediate, in the atmospheric sense of what it means to be together in a shared room, in a shared environment. And this loneliness is increasing, and what we need is the constant experience or a repeating experience being together in a shared space where we can touch each other, feel each other. That would be a first requirement. And then what we have to kind of cultivate again is the experience of how it feels to be bodily, the experience of being bodily in all kinds of sensual ways, feeling your embodiment in the lived presence of meditation, for example, or feeling your embodiment in contact with nature, where you mindfully experience how nature is related to your own body, because that is one of the most basic ways of embeddedness in the world, feeling the similarity and feeling the, uh, the embeddedness in
Conviviality.
nature.
Yeah.
The conviviality, exactly. So this is something that we often lose in our constantly accelerating society, and the constant striving for self-optimization. And we can ourselves and make us mutually attentive to how it feels like to be really present. That is what we could help each other to regain the feeling of really being really present. But that is, of course, something that is in contrast and in opposition to the constantly accelerating speed of communication, of mobility, of economic processes, of technological progress that characterizes our Western society. So we need
Yes.
something like a balance between the two principles of time, so to speak, the linear principle of constant acceleration of the linear flight of time, so to speak, on the one hand, and the more cyclical, repetitive, rhythmic, and present forms of experience of time that are more adequate to our basic to our basic processes of life. And this balance is something that we can, well, help each other to acquire in our interaction with others.
I like the idea of time. In this nestedness that we've been talking about, this getting away from linearity, you also talk about that in terms of time. And that can be helpful for us to also locate ourselves as part of life in a continuity of life. And as I was reading your book, I was thinking, realizing the second person stance, which I don't think is a public kind of idea, but starting to take that in a public sort of way, that's real, that interrelation is real, trying to talk about that in an everyday way also helps us not to confuse our algorithms and our models and our technology with ourselves in the way we were talking about before, because then we can see that those are like the books, right? They're ways we're trying to share our experience with one another in that relation.
Absolutely.
Before we go, I have to bring up the word love. So I don't know how all this relates to trying to understand these themes, and how has this theme related to your own path in life, and how have you kept yourself aware of that second person interrelation in a world where you could have gone either way, because you're in philosophy, you're in medicine, and there's always the pull to take the third person or the first person rather than the second person perspective.
Absolutely, yes. Precisely being in a interdisciplinary field, kind of a living bridge between a philosophical, more reflective stance or attitude towards the world on the one hand, and being a psychiatrist and psychotherapist with an attitude of second person togetherness. And
a lot of people praise your work to me because they know that I know you, and they often say that they really respect that you've stayed in a lot of different fields and tried to maintain that. Is that part of how you've been able to maintain that position, that connection?
Precisely. I would say, despite the difficulties that you encounter, of course, with such a in a way ambivalent path through life, precisely through that you, of course, gain the best of both fields, so to speak, and can combine both fields in a new way. And I always realize that that there is a danger in losing one pole of my existence. So I always try to to balance these two poles, because I realize that I don't feel well with either of them alone, and that they both are fruitful for each other. So I gain so much for the psychiatric work, for psychopathology, for psychotherapy, through thinking about the about the human being in very basic and in a very foundational sense. I gain so much an understanding and being able to help people understand themselves better than they do. And I gain so much the other way around for philosophical thinking about the human being through the experiences of suffering people. How is it to suffer from depersonalization, feeling alien to the world? How is it to suffer from depression, feeling constant rigidity in your body, and the embodied relation to the world is somehow interrupted because the body becomes a rigid, constricted object? So how does it feel then to experience the lack of attunement to others? All this helps you to better understand our basic condition as human beings. And this is how the psychiatry impacts on my philosophical thought. So there's such a rich mutual, well, advantage, so to speak. Yeah, there's such a rich, fruitful exchange between the two poles that I would never have liked to miss one of them.
As you were talking, I realized that that's actually an example of the practice of this in practice, because it can be so easy to go into your thoughts if you're just studying philosophy in the way that you brought up with the Descartes analogy. But then similarly, if you're only dealing with the subjectivity of it, this can also become something like the burden of the Dostoevsky. So thank you for that. And I guess just the last question, this is love and philosophy. So we've been talking about it the whole time in a way, but love, what is this second person interrelation a kind of expression of what we try to point at with that word, would you say?
The word love relates to this attitude of an engaged kind of science, so to speak, because it views the science as not something which can be done from a detached and unengaged point of view, but it looks at science as something which changes our knowledge of the world through engagement. The traditional view of science, even of philosophy, was to bring the subject into a position of autonomy, of independence, of detachment from its object. So the object could be, that was the idea, recognized and investigated all the better. The more the observer, the more the scientist is detached from it. So all the engagement, all emotional involvement should be overcome. And there is another notion of knowledge, of recognition, and that is the one that we need in contact with nature. That is what I called conviviality, but all the more we need it in contact with other human beings. So recognizing, understanding the other is only possible in a relationship of loving engagement, where the other shows him or herself to you as an convivial being, as a co-human being, and thus becomes understandable, becomes visible, becomes accessible to you in his or her core. And that is a completely different notion of knowledge. So the knowledge theory of an embodied view of science, of psychiatry, of course, as well, the knowledge theory would be a loving knowledge theory. Maybe I can just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's perfect. And I think that's what people pick up on in your practice of the way you're coming at your work, as you're approaching it from that point of view, which is not always easy, but I think something I want to say thank you for, and that I know a lot of other people really appreciate about the way that you've made through all these different subjects. Is there anything we need to touch on before we go that we didn't talk about that you want to be sure we say or that gets in here?
No,
Okay.
Oh, I'm fine with that. We touched upon many very deep issues, but there might be others, but nothing that immediately comes to my mind.
Yeah, I think that's good for today. I just want to say thank you, Thomas. And
You're welcome.
yeah, I really appreciate your book, and I'll definitely be recommending it, of course. And all right, hope you have a good day there.